Hello and welcome. This is Bot101 and I'm Angela Nishimoto. Okay, today we're doing gymnosperms, all right? So we're going to go into the seed because with the gymnosperms we get introduced to the concept of the seed again. Okay, we're going to do a survey of gymnosperms and we might even have time for some uses of gymnosperms today. Okay? So the first topic are the seeds, okay? Now the oldest seeds were from the Devonian period, more than 350 million years ago, okay? So they were produced by plants in a significant adaptation for land plants, okay? Unlike spores, they have protective seed coats and food reserves, okay? So the embryo may lie dormant, may just kind of lie there wherever it lands in the seed, through freezing weather, okay, through prolonged drought, and even through fire, and maybe still survive. So the seed coats are protective, and there's food along with that too, okay? So the seeds have survival value. Okay, right now, seed plants are the dominant vegetation on Earth. Right? Now the first seed plants were fern-like, okay? They have found fossils with obvious seeds on their fronds, and these they at first called teratosperms, which means seed ferns, of course. But then what they did is they decided that they weren't ferns at all, which is true, and they now place them in the gymnosperms, all these fossils. Okay. Now here's a fossil of a seed fern. Okay. Very beautiful. You can see the little pinnae on the sides here. Okay. And 20 millimeters. So this is kind of sizable. Okay, now definition of gymnosperms. Gymnos means naked, and sperma means seed. So gymnosperms means plants that have naked seeds. That means that they have an exposed seed, okay, that's produced on the surface of sporophylls or on the leaves, okay, or sporophylls or leaves that produce spores, right? And the seeds are not enclosed within fruits, as we saw in angiosperms, right? Yeah, the seed-bearing sporophylls, and they're spirally arranged, okay, in structures called strobili. Okay, remember the word strobili? We had it before. And the singular of it is strobilus, okay? And seed cones. There's a nice picture of a seed cone, okay, female cone, okay? Now the pollen-bearing cones or pollen-bearing strobili, okay? Pollen cones produce pollen or pollen grains, all right? But now the female gametophyte inside the ovule, okay, it has this kind of fleshy tissue called the nucellus, okay? And this is within outer layers of tissues, okay? And it's within a structure known as the integument, all right? And the integument becomes a seed coat after fertilization, and of course the seed coat protects the seed, okay, or the structures inside the seed, okay? And all these tissues are from the mother of the offspring plant. Okay, so what we have here in the gymnosperms is a maternal investment in the next generation, sort of like humans, okay? Or some animals, mammals, right? Okay, here's a look at the female structure here. Okay, I guess this is the nucellus. Okay, and the tissue inside. This is a pretty good thing. It's kind of a little hard to see, but these will probably later become the integument, so the seed coat. Okay. Now the sporophytes of gymnosperms are mostly trees and shrubs. There are a few that are vines. Okay. Now in gymnosperms, the gametophyte is more reduced in cell number, okay, more than in ferns and the fern relatives. And the gametophyte develops within the sporophyte and is completely dependent on the sporophyte. It doesn't grow independently, okay, like we saw in the mosses. Okay. Now, according to the fossil record, flowering plants may have evolved from gymnosperms. And of course, we're talking about flowering plants because flowering plants are the most important kind of plants to us. Okay, but in the gymnosperms, there are 4 phyla. You remember phyla is the level, phylums, or phylum, or phyla, plural, are the level below kingdom, right? So there are 4 phyla within the grouping that we call the gymnosperms. First of all, we have the phylum Pinophyta, or the conifers. There's a beautiful picture of a coniferous forest there. Okay, so these particular kinds of gymnosperms have distinctive strobili. They make those pine cones, okay, and they have their needle-like leaves in clusters. Right. We also have the phylum Ginkgophyta. Okay, these have notched, fan-shaped leaves. And they have a mature seed like plums, like little plums, okay, kind of enclosed in a fleshy coating, okay. And there's only one species in the phylum, and that's Ginkgo biloba. We'll talk about that later on, okay. And here's a nice photograph of a ginkgo tree. So ginkgos can get fairly large. They can get to be 80 feet tall, okay. They're also very popular in some mainland cities as street trees because they're very attractive. Okay. Then the third phylum that we're going to cover are the Cycadophyta, or the cycads. Okay. These are slow-growing plants. I remember that I had a cycad for years and it didn't do anything. What I did is I had it in a pot. I bought it in a pot. I left it in the pot, and it maybe put out 2 leaves in maybe 2 years, something like that. Anyway, I ended up planting it in the garden of my landlord that we live with in Palolo. Okay, it's a nice plant though. Okay, they sort of look like palms. They sort of look like a cross between a tree fern and a palm tree, but they're not really related closely to either. Okay, and as you can see from this picture, the strobili, so here's one that's spent. These are male strobili that make pollen, okay? So one is done, the other one is in the full flush of its glory, right? And the strobili are at the center of the plant, okay? So the cycads have about 300 species. They're not that populous at all, okay? Then we have the phylum Gnetophyta, or the gnetophytes, okay? These are distinguished by having vessels and tracheids in the xylem, okay? Many of these sort of superficially look like angiosperms, but they do produce strobili, and they are about 70 species, okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at maybe 3 examples of these groups, okay? Okay, so the first group we're going to look at are the Pinophyta. Okay, so we have here a little piece of a branch. Okay, we have mostly dried specimens and those in plastic. All right, so you can see the pine needles, needle-shaped leaves on this branches here. Okay, and here we have one with leaves and a cone. Okay, a female cone. Generally, you can tell this is a female cone because the male cones are not persistent. They tend to fall apart after they bear their pollen. Okay, and here we have a more sizable cone. This may be more what people are most familiar with when you think of a pine cone or a cone of the members of the Pinophyta. Okay. And here we have some specimens of different kinds of conifer twigs or branches. Okay. We have here spruce. Okay. We have here hemlock. And we have here arbor vitae. Okay. So all of these, you can see that there are similarities between them and differences too. So of course they're in slightly different groups. Okay. And now here we have some reproductive parts of a pine. Okay. So here you have a male cone. So the male cone looks more sturdy here, but actually they really do fall apart after they disperse their pollen. Okay. And the female generally takes at least 2 years to mature. So here's a first year female cone. Okay. Here's a second year female cone. I'm sorry, I got mixed up. This is a third year female cone. That's why it looks so sturdy. This is the male cone here, so it kind of falls apart after it does its job. Okay. And then what we have here is an example of ginkgo. Okay. So ginkgo, of course, is a gymnosperm, but look at the leaf. It's kind of fan-shaped. Oftentimes it's notched between the two halves of the leaves. And you have branching, like hair-like veins in the leaf that branch off dichotomously. Do you remember what dichotomous means? All right. So here you have a female structure or ovulate strobilus. Okay. Here you have the male structure or staminate strobilus. And these are born on different plants. And the female will eventually develop a seed. Okay, so this is not a fruit. This is just a seed. It has a fleshy outer covering. Okay, so that's ginkgo. Okay, only one species, Ginkgo biloba. Okay, and then what we have next are some cycad pieces. Okay, so here we have one leaf of a cycad. As you can see, it is a compound leaf. All right, do you remember what kind of compound leaf this is? Okay, it's a pinnately compound leaf, so this is a dried leaf, and it's fairly hard, and you can see that it does look like a palm leaf, but it is not a palm. Palm leaves tend to be softer, and this is pretty sturdy and hard, and can poke you pretty, hardly if you touch it the wrong way. Okay, but these cycads have these beautiful dark green leaves oftentimes. Okay, and here we have what remains of a female structure here, but this is a female structure that has not actually been fertilized. These are actually unfertilized ovules, these dark structures here, and some of them have fallen out, but this at least is a representative of the female structure of a cycad. Okay, so they have female structures on female plants and male structures on male plants. All right, so we'll go back to the computer. Okay, so we're back. Okay, and this is a picture of one of the neophytes. Okay, this is Welwitschia. Okay, it's a native of the Namib Desert in southwestern Africa. You can see it's a unusual looking plant, but we'll go into that a little bit later. Okay, so first of all, we're going to do a little thing on the phylum Pinophyta, or the conifers. Okay, this used to be known as the Coniferophyta, right? And they number approximately 600 species in the phylum Pinophyta. Okay, and they include the pines, the firs, the spruces, the hemlocks, the cedars, the redwoods, and others. Okay, look how beautiful these plants are, majestic and everything like that. Okay, so the largest group among the Pinophyta are the pines in the genus Pinus. There are more than 100 species of pinus, and these are dominant in the coniferous forests of the northern hemisphere. You know, the coniferous forests that actually covered northern North America, okay, from the upper United States to Canada, and then you had coniferous forests in Asia and in Europe, okay, in the upper latitudes, okay. And so this phylum, okay, or this group, this pines, includes the oldest living known organism, which is called the bristlecone pine. You might have heard of it before, okay? So this plant is native to the White Mountains of California, okay, and the Snake Range, okay? And some of them are more than 4,500 years old, okay? So here's a look at the bristlecone pine. Okay, these actually grow very slowly, very slowly. So if you actually see a section of the wood of this plant, the sections are barely more than a millimeter or so wide, okay, the rings, all right? Now this group has needle-like leaves, and these are arranged in clusters called fascicles. Okay, so each fascicle will form a cylinder if the leaves are held together. Okay, and usually in the fascicles, there are usually 2 to 5 leaves each. Okay, so fascicles are actually short shoots with restricted growth. All right, that's a feature of gymnosperms. Okay, it's not found in angiosperms. Okay, another thing about let's see, in this group, the pines, they often live where the topsoil is frozen. Okay, so here's the grove, okay, in which a great basin bristlecone pine called Prometheus lives. Okay, Pinus longiva, right? Look at that kind of bleak landscape, but it has its own kind of beauty, yeah? Okay, so they live in difficult environments sometimes, often live where the topsoil is frozen for at least part of the year, and it's difficult for the root of the plant to get water, right? Leaves tend to be exposed to high winds and extremely cold temperatures. Okay, so here's a look at some of the needle-like leaves of this particular pine. Look at that, it looks kind of cold where it is. I kind of think that those white flecks on it might be snow, but it's kind of hard to tell. Very beautiful still. Okay, now some of the adaptations that allow them to survive in the harsh environments that they live in include a hypodermis, okay, which is under the epidermis. So the hypodermis is one to several layers of thick-walled cells that's coated with a thick cuticle. You remember where the cuticle is? It's like a waxy layer, right? So it has a thick cuticle. These plants also have recessed stomata. Okay, that means that they're under, they're not really at the surface of the leaf. Okay, that's to protect them from drying out. Okay, they're in cavities on the leaf. Okay. They also have endodermis that surrounds the veins. Okay, so here we have a photograph of a recessed stomate. So here's a stomate here. Here are the guard cells. Okay, and you can see it's under the surface. Okay, so it actually is under there to protect it from too much wind and too much cold. Okay. So there are no air spaces in the mesophyll, okay, unlike what we remember the spongy mesophyll of angiosperms. Okay. They also have resin canals. What are these? These are tubes that are lined with resin-secreting cells. And what is resin? Resin is a substance that's aromatic and also antiseptic. Okay. From resin you get turpentine, you get rosin, okay? And this resin actually prevents the development of fungi, so it helps protect the plant. and also helps to keep insects from eating the plant as much as they would if there weren't any resin present. Okay, now remember those clusters of leaves? These fascicles abscise, or they drop off the plant after about 2 to 5 years. But on bristlecone pines, it might take up to 30 years before the fascicles are lost. Okay, and usually the fascicles are lost only a few at a time, so that there are some viable leaves present on the tree at all times, as long as the tree is healthy. Okay. Now, pine wood is mostly tracheids. They have no vessel elements or fibers. Okay, and so they have what we call softwood. Okay, softwood has an absence of thick-walled cells, whereas we get hardwoods from broadleaf plants. Okay, such as dicots, right? Now the rings of xylem in the pines are wide in cross-section, okay? And that's an indication that they grow very quickly during the growing season, okay? And there are resin canals that are formed throughout the tissues, okay? So next we have an illustration, or sort of like a schematic diagram. So this, I think, is a root of a gymnosperm. Okay, so you have the epidermis, you have the cortex. Here you have the endodermis with the Casparian strip that prevents too much water from getting out. Okay, and the pericycle, which is like a meristem. Okay, then you have the parenchyma outside the phloem, and here you have the phloem itself and the cambium. Okay, the parenchyma outside the xylem. Okay, and here we have a resin duct. Okay, so the resin ducts can be almost anywhere in the plant, in the roots, in the stems, okay, in the leaves, right? They may be arranged horizontally, or they may be arranged vertically in the plant, okay? So resin ducts occur all over the plants, in the pines. Okay, now the bark includes secondary phloem, and this may be thick. It may be more than 3 inches, okay, 3+ inches. And in the giant redwoods, they're up to 2 feet, amazingly, okay. And here in this photograph, there's a cross-section of a redwood. Okay, so I guess this is actually the part that has a phloem in it here, okay. And these plants do not have companion cells, okay, like the flowering plants do. So the companion cells are absent from the phloem, but these other cells, called albuminous cells, probably do the same function as the companion cells. They help to load the phloem with sugar, okay. Now these plants, these pines, have mycorrhizae associated with the roots. You remember what mycorrhizae are? Mycorrhizae are symbiotic fungi that live along with the roots of plants, okay? So they actually help the plant take up water and nutrients, and the roots actually give the fungus some place to live. So we've seen mycorrhizae in mosses, we've seen mycorrhizae in Psilotum, we've seen mycorrhizae in the other fern allies and in some ferns. Okay, now here we also see them in the gymnosperms. Okay. Another thing is that the roots of adjacent plants can interweave with each other when they grow closely together. Okay. And New England pioneers took advantage of this. So what they did with the eastern white pine is that they'd actually chop it down and then tip over the stumps with the roots attached. So they actually have a whole bunch of roots sticking up in the air, okay, making a fence, okay. So these fences survive for many years. Okay, these pines are very persistent, okay. Okay, so here's a look at an eastern white pine, Pinus strobus. Look how big it is. So that man looks like he's measuring the circumference, yeah, at about his height, maybe 5 feet, 6 feet. I can't tell how tall he is. Okay. Now reproduction, this is going to be a long one. Okay. So these plants produce two kinds of spores, like the spike mosses, like the quillworts, and a few ferns that we mentioned, like Marsilia. Okay. So they have pollen cones are papery or membranous. All right. And the scales of these cones are arranged around an axis, and they tend to develop toward the tips of the lower branches of the plants. Okay. And there may be 50 or more of these in clusters. All right. And they're mostly about 1.5 inches long. Okay. And microsporangia, that word again, microsporangia, develop toward the bases of the scales. Okay. So don't let the vocabulary throw you. Okay. We're using the same terminology that we learned before, and they all mean the same thing. Okay, so the micro means a male, right? So here's a look at some male cones when they're young, because when the cones are young, they tend to be reddish or purplish. Okay, they sometimes take a while to mature. Okay, so the microsporocytes are the sites that actually make the spores. Okay, in the microsporangia, or the sporangia that are male, they do meiosis. And they produce 4 haploid microspores, okay, or male spores. And these become the pollen grains. Okay? So each grain has 4 cells and a pair of air sacs. And the air sacs lend it buoyancy, so the seeds tend to be carried farther in the wind away from its parent plant. Okay? I mean, not the seeds, but the pollen grain. Get carried away. Okay. So here's a cross section of a pollen strobilus. Okay. You can see that they don't look really that sturdy. All right. Now megaspores are produced in megasporangia, and mega means large, and this refers to the female. Okay. They're within the ovules at the bases of the seed cone scales, like we told you before, right? So seed cones can be big. They can be up to 2 feet long in sugar pines, okay? They can be as heavy as 5 pounds in coulter pines, right? And the woody scales are arranged around an axis when it's mature, okay? And these seed cones are mostly produced on upper branches, right? And oftentimes on the same trees as pollen cones. Do you remember what this is called? When you have male and female structures on the same plant, right? That's actually referring to monoecy. Remember one house, monoecy, M-O-N-O-E-C-Y, one house. Male structures and female structures on the same plant. That's monoecy. Okay? Now here we have a diagram of the life history of a pine. So here we have the sporophyte here. Okay, and on this one here, it's monoecious. It has a pollen cone and seed cone, okay, on the same plant. Okay, the seed cone develops ovules. Okay, the pollen cone eventually develops pollen, okay, pollen grains. The pollen grains actually grow into the ovule, and then you have the fusion and the development of the zygote and the development of the embryo from the zygote. And the zygote, of course, is 1 sperm and 1 egg united, right? So this here is the little baby plant of the next generation. Here's that wing on the seed, okay? And here it looks like we have a little embryo here, and this, if it germinates, if it grows, if it survives, will grow into a mature sporophyte. Okay? Now ovules are in pairs at the base of scales. Okay? And the ovule has the megasporangium. That's just the part that bears the spores. and this contains a nucellus and the megasporocyte, or the cell that makes the spores. Okay, and these are enclosed by the structure known as the integument, and the integument is thick and layered. Okay, the integument has a micropyle that's like a little opening, like a little vase-like opening. Okay, and one layer of the integument becomes a seed coat. Okay, so here's a look. This is like the micropyle here. Here's a nucellus. Okay, nice diagram, or nice photograph. Okay, now the megasporocyte undergoes meiosis. That must have been a megasporocyte. Okay, and produces 4 megaspores. Now of these 4 megaspores, 3 of them die. Okay, and 1 survives and develops into the female gametophyte, and usually takes a period of months for the female gametophyte to develop. And the female gametophyte is larger. It may be thousands of cells large. Okay, and the nucellus itself is a food source for the developing embryo. Okay, and as a gametophyte develop, there are 2 to 6 archegonia at the micropyle end. Remember, the micropyle is that little channel, that little hole at one end. Okay, so each of these archegonia have a single large egg. Okay, so here's looking at an archegonium. Okay, this is actually an archegonium of a cycad. Okay, but we can actually have a nice photograph here. Okay, so it can be seen through the female gametophyte tissue here, but here is probably where the egg is. Okay, and here's the opening here. Okay, so seed cones tend to be reddish or purplish at first, and they take at least 2 seasons to mature. Okay, they grow and they become green, then they turn brown. Okay, during the first spring, the scales spread apart, and the pollen blowing the wind sifts down between the scales. Okay, and the pollen catches in sticky fluid that is exuded, okay, from the female archegonium. Okay, and the pollen is drawn through the micropyle as the fluid evaporates to the top of the nucellus. Okay, so here are some female cones, okay, when they're young. And here's a more mature female cone. You can see how hard and tough it looks. Okay. So after pollination, the scales grow together and close in order to protect the ovule. Okay. Then we have meiosis and megaspore development occur a month after pollination happens. Okay, about a month anyway. Okay, so the female gametophyte and the archegonia don't actually mature until more than a year later. It's very slow development. Okay, now getting back to the male, the pollen grain produces a pollen tube, and that grows to the nucellus into the archegonia. Okay, 2 or 4 cells enter the tube. Okay, so these are the male, okay, haploid cells. So one is a generative cell, and that divides, and it forms a sterile cell and a spermatogenous cell. Okay, now the spermatogenous cell then divides, and what does it do? It makes 2 sperms. Okay, now a noteworthy thing about these sperms is that they don't have flagella. Pretty much all the life histories that we've been through before about plants, all the sperms had flagella. So all of them needed to swim to the female. Okay? So the mature male gametophyte, okay, is actually a germinated pollen with a pollen tube and 2 sperms. Okay, note that there are no antheridium formed. Okay? So there's archegonia, but there are no antheridia. Okay. Now about 15 months after pollination, the pollen tube arrives at the archegonium, then they unite and it discharges its contents. Okay, so one sperm and an egg together fuse and become the zygote. Okay, the other sperm and other cells of the pollen die. Okay, and the zygote, of course, becomes the embryo. That's a new baby plant of the next generation, and it's nourished by the female gametophyte. Okay, this way of reproduction is sort of similar to fraternal twins or triplets in animals. Fraternal twins, not identical twins. Okay, so they're from like different eggs. Okay, so embryo may divide too. Okay, and that would be like identical twins or quadruplets in animals. Okay, then the embryos develop at the ends of suspensor cells, okay, which are connected to the rosette cells. Okay, then only one embryo actually completely develops. Okay, so one integument layer hardens and becomes a seed coat, and there's a thin layer on the scale that becomes a wing on each seed. Okay, that may help the seed disperse, okay, with wind. Okay, also there might be animals such as squirrels and other animals might break open the cones, you know, to see if there's food inside. That's probably their motivation. Here's another life history. Here's a sporophyte. Okay. Here's a pollen-bearing cone, and there's a microsporophyle and microsporangia. Okay. Making microspore mother cells that make microspores that develop into pollen grains. Okay. Then here's a seed cone, okay, with ovule, megaspore mother cell, develops the 4 megaspores, and then eventually the archegonium develops. Okay, and here's the female gametophyte or megagametophyte. Anyway, so you have the pollen bearing cones shedding their pollen, okay, fertilizing the female or pollinating the female, which fertilization takes place a lot later. Okay, there's a pollen grain here, microgametophyte. Here's a micropyle here. Okay, and here you have the megagametophytes, the archegonium, and the egg. Okay, and then you have the zygote developing. Here's a suspensor cell. Okay, developing embryos. Right. Here's a wing on the seed, and here you actually have the megagametophyte with the embryo inside. Okay, so when it germinates and grows, if it germinates and grows, then it will develop into a new sporophyte, and then the sexual cycle continues. So you have a diploid sporophyte phase, and you have a haploid gametophyte phase, or alternation in generations, which we've seen before. Okay? So it's a plant, just like any other plant. Okay? Now the lodgepole pine, the jack pine, the knobcone pine, well, these pines, their cones stay on the trees with the scales closed, okay, until they're seared open by fire or they open from old age. Okay? This is a lodgepole pine, Pinus contorta. Okay, what a beautiful plant. These needles. Look at the cone. Okay, probably a female cone. Now we also have other conifers. Okay, so some don't actually make a woody seed cone with obvious scales, and some don't produce pollen and seed cones on the same plant. Okay. So we have yew, also known as taxus, in California nutmeg or toria. They produce ovules singly, you know, one by one at the tips or short shoots. Okay. And each ovule is covered by an arrow, which is a fleshy cup-like covering, Okay, in U's, this is bright red and open at one end. Okay, and the ovule is produced on a female plant. Okay, and pollen cones are produced on the male plant. Okay, so here's a look at a U, English U, okay, with arrow. Okay, so here's a arrow and the seed inside. Okay, so the seed will be inside and the arrow is the cover. It looks almost like a fruit, doesn't it? But of course it's not a fruit. It's just a fleshy covering for the seed. Okay. So what is this called when you have the ovule produced on the female plant and the pollen cones on the male plant? Do you remember what that's called? Remember, monese is when you have male and female on the same plant, or when you have male and female on different plants, it's called dioece. Remember that? Okay. Now this is podocarpus. Okay, this is actually a plant of the southern hemisphere, unusual for a conifer. Okay, these are ornamentals in areas with mild climates. Okay. They have fleshy coated seeds produced singly, similar to the seeds of yew. Okay. So the origin of fleshy seeds is not clear. They think maybe that yews and podocarps diverged from other conifers very early in the evolution of gymnosperms. Okay. So here are the seeds of podocarpus. Okay, they have this fleshy subtending structure here on the seeds. Okay, the seeds are edible too. Now the scales or seed cones of junipers are also fleshy at maturity. They look actually more like berries than cones. Okay, so here are the cones of the juniper. Here are the seeds. They're kind of small, only 3 to 4 millimeters long. Okay, this is a beautiful photograph. Now there are 2 species of California redwoods that are kind of famous, okay, for their sizes, their heights, and their longevity. Okay, so one species are the coastal redwoods. They can grow up to 295 feet, and there's a particular tree called Hyperion that is 379 feet tall. It's the tallest conifer known, and Hyperion lives in Northern California. And then there are the giant redwoods of the Sierra Nevadas. Okay, you have General Sherman, which measures 101.5 feet in circumference, okay, right above the ground, and it's 79 feet in circumference, 5 feet above the ground. Okay, it weighs more than 6,000 tons. Oh my gosh, and it's more than 3,500 years old. General Sherman. That must be General Sherman. See, it has this big hole here, and it's able to survive with this because, of course, the phloem still survives in the areas that haven't been carved away. Okay. They're beautiful trees. I got to go to Muir Woods once to see the trees there. They're just gorgeous. Okay, so here's the anatomy of a redwood. Okay, you have the bark, you have the cambium. Remember, the cambium is a meristem. Okay, the core cambium. Here you have the sapwood, okay, which is a functioning part of the xylem. Then you have the heartwood, which is non-functional. Okay, here you have something called a burl, like an outgrowth with a sprout sprouting off of it. Okay. Now, other gymnosperms are not as numerous or well known as the conifers. Okay, they include the ginkgos, the cycads, and the needlephytes. Okay, so this is Neetum, Neiman probably. Here's a cycad looking like a palm, and here's the ginkgo again. Okay, so the phylum Ginkgophyta, also known as ginkgo. Okay, there's only one living species that still survives. Okay, and its name is Ginkgo biloba, right? And the Chinese words for its name mean silver apricot. In fact, the name ginkgo is a mistake because when the Westerners first discovered this tree, they were in Japan, okay, and the people there called it ginkgo. But the botanist who wrote the name down wrote a G instead of a Y, so it became known as ginkgo, and it's been known as that name since, okay? So the name means silver apricot. So fossils show that the Ginkgoaceae, or the family that ginkgo comes from, were widely distributed in the northern hemisphere, and it's called a living fossil because until its discovery, I think it was in the 1800s, people in the Western world thought that this plant was extinct, or all of them were extinct. Okay? So here's a look at some leaves. You can see sometimes they're bilobed. They have like a little notch between the two halves of the leaf. They're fan-shaped, and you can sort of see the veins that are dichotomous branching. That means that each of the veins branches into two kind of evenly. Okay? So they have these notched, fan-shaped leaves. So they're often called the maidenhair tree because you have these leaves that they kind of look like the pinnae of maidenhair ferns. Okay? And it's a popular street tree in the United States, widely cultivated in the mainland. Okay? I know I saw a ginkgo plant at a garden shop here in Hawaii. I think it was Koala Farmers. I saw it was kind of like a small plant, only about this big. And I was thinking, oh, I really wanted to get it because I wanted to show my students, you know. But then I thought, oh, it's not probably going to survive very well because it's just too warm for it here. It likes the temperate kind of areas where it gets cool. Okay? Now, it has leaves with no midrib or prominent veins, and the veins branch dichotomously, just like we just talked about. Okay? So here's a male. Okay? Here are the leaves. Here are the male shobali. Okay, they make pollen. And here's a female with the ovules, ovule-bearing structures, fan-shaped leaves. So in this plant, this is actually have male trees with male parts and female trees with female parts. Okay. So remember, what does dichotomous mean? We talked about that. It means that it branches evenly into forks, two forks from one base. Okay. So these are deciduous. Okay, so leaves turn a bright yellow before they abscise. Okay. They have a life cycle that's similar to pines. And you have male tree with male parts, female trees with female parts. And you remember what this is called? Okay. Think about it, all right? So pollination is followed by fertilization with flagellated sperms. Here we have flagellated sperms again, okay? And mature seeds are encased in fleshy seed coats, okay? So in the United States, the male trees are preferred, and they're usually propagated from cuttings because the female trees with the seed flesh has this kind of nauseating odor, okay, and it can also cause skin irritation for some people. Okay, and pollination is followed by fertilization. So mature seeds and fleshy seed coats. So in China and Korea, the seeds are a delicacy. Okay, they're supposed to taste really good. I don't think I've ever eaten ginkgo. Maybe I should try. Yeah. So in China and Korea, female trees predominate because they prefer female trees for the seeds. Okay. Let's see. Okay, here's a coconut dessert. Here you see some seeds of ginkgo in here along with the coconut and whatever kind of maybe coconut water, I imagine, with a little sugar inside. That would be really good. Okay, here's some seeds. Okay, now the cycadophyta are the cycads. It looks like a cross of a tree fern and a palm, but it's not related to either really. Okay, it's a slow-growing plant. Okay, it lives in the tropics and subtropics, and they have unbranched trunks. They're like trees, and some of them are over 50 feet tall. Okay, and they have a crown of large pinnate leaves, just like the leaves we just saw. Okay, so here's a look at a cycad. Doesn't it look like a palm? It really does, doesn't it? Okay. So there are about 300 species of cycads, and several of them are facing extinction. Okay. So they have a life cycle that's similar to that of conifers. Okay. Except that pollination sometimes occurs by means of beetles as the agent of pollination. Okay. And each sperm has 10,000 to 20,000 flagella. Isn't that amazing? I wonder who counted that. Okay. Another thing is they are dioecious. Remember what dioecious means? You have male structures on male plants and female structures on female plants. So the pollen strobilus and the seed strobilus are on different plants. And in some species, the strobili are huge. Okay, they can be more than 3 feet long and more than 100 pounds. Okay? Okay, I think with that, we're going to kind of call it a halt to this survey right now, and we'll return next time with the rest of the survey and some uses of gymnosperms, and until then, aloha.